Neighbor calls cops on man wearing Harris-Walz hat, only to discover he's the new police chief. The sun cast a warm glow over the pristine lawns and neatly trimmed hedges of Willow Creek. The neighborhood was known for its quiet charm, a place where nothing ever seemed out of order. Residents prided themselves on keeping things that way. The sound of sprinklers clicking rhythmically, the faint laughter of children playing in backyards, and the occasional bark of a dog were the usual soundtrack to life here. But on this particular day, a man was walking down Magnolia Lane, and his presence was disrupting the neighborhood's fragile sense of calm. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He wasn't shouting, loitering, or behaving suspiciously. He was simply walking at a leisurely pace, his hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the houses as though he were taking in the sights. But it was the black baseball cap perched on his head that drew attention. The bold white letters, Harris-Walz, made it impossible to miss. To some, it was just a hat. To others, it was a statement, one they weren't willing to tolerate in their idyllic little bubble. From the window of her two-story colonial home, Eleanor Crandall peered out, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of the man. She set her teacup down on the saucer with a faint clink and leaned closer to the window. She had lived in Willow Creek for 30 years, and in her mind, she had become the unofficial gatekeeper of its unwritten rules. And one of those rules, as far as she was concerned, was that no one wore a hat like that in her neighborhood. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched the man stroll past her driveway. He didn't seem rushed or flustered, which only irritated her more. How could someone so blatantly flaunt such a divisive symbol and act like it was perfectly normal? She turned away from the window, snatched up her phone, and dialed the familiar number of her next-door neighbor. "Charlie," she said, her tone sharp and urgent. "There's someone walking down Magnolia Lane. He's wearing one of those hats." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Charlie Thompson's voice crackled through. "One of those hats?" he asked, his confusion evident. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," Eleanor snapped. "A Harris-Walz hat. He's just strolling around like he owns the place." Charlie sighed audibly. "Eleanor, it's probably just someone passing through. Let it go." "Passing through?" Eleanor scoffed. "People like that don't just pass through Willow Creek. He's here for a reason, and I don't trust it." Charlie muttered something under his breath, but Eleanor was relentless. "Call the police," she insisted. "Let them deal with it. Don't you think that's a bit much?" Charlie asked, though his voice lacked conviction. "Do you want to wait until he does something?" Eleanor retorted. "By then, it'll be too late. Call them." With a reluctant sigh, Charlie hung up. Eleanor returned to her window, her arms crossed as she watched the man continue his walk. Across the street, another neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, had also noticed the man and was now stepping onto her porch, her hands clutching her pearls. "Do you see him?" Eleanor called out from her own porch, her voice low but conspiratorial. Mrs. Carmichael nodded grimly. "I do. What's he even doing here?" "Trouble," Eleanor said simply. "I already told Charlie to call the police. He's probably doing it now." Mrs. Carmichael frowned, her gaze fixed on the man as he reached the corner and paused, looking around as if deciding which direction to go. "I don't like this," she muttered. "What kind of person walks through here wearing something like that?" "Someone who doesn't belong," Eleanor replied. "I'll bet you anything he's up to no good." Meanwhile, Charlie was still debating whether to make the call. He stood by his kitchen window, watching as the man lingered by a tree on the corner, adjusting his cap before continuing his walk. With a resigned shake of his head, Charlie picked up his phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. "Yeah, hi," he began, glancing nervously back at the window. "I'm calling about a suspicious individual in the neighborhood. He's walking down Magnolia Lane wearing a Harris-Walz hat." The operator's tone remained neutral. "What exactly is the individual doing, sir?" Charlie hesitated, realizing he didn't have much to report. "He's just walking, but he doesn't look familiar, and the hat. It's political, you know." The operator's pause made Charlie feel a little foolish, but he pressed on. "Look, this is a nice neighborhood, and we don't usually have people like that around here. We'll send someone to check it out," the operator replied, Her tone clipped. "Thank you for your call." Charlie hung up, his stomach knotting with unease. He didn't entirely agree with Eleanor's paranoia, but something about the man did make him uncomfortable. He returned to his window, watching as the man crossed the street and began walking toward the small park at the end of the lane. By now, several other neighbors had noticed him. Curtains twitched, heads poked out of doorways, and low murmurs spread through the block like wildfire. A young woman watering her plants froze mid-motion, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the hat. A man walking his dog paused, his brow furrowing before he quickly turned in the opposite direction. The man himself seemed unfazed by the attention. He stopped at the edge of the park, his hands resting on his hips as he took in the scene. Children played on the swings, couples strolled hand in hand, and a few joggers passed by on the trails. He smiled faintly, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. Back at her house, Eleanor was on the phone again, this time with Mrs. Carmichael. "He's at the park now," she hissed, "probably scoping it out. Should we go over there?" Mrs. Carmichael asked, her voice tinged with nervous energy. "Absolutely not," Eleanor replied. "Let the police handle it." As if on cue, the faint sound of sirens reached their ears, growing louder as a black and white patrol car turned onto Magnolia Lane. Eleanor felt a rush of vindication. "Finally," she muttered. The car pulled up alongside the man, and an officer stepped out, his expression calm but alert. He adjusted his belt as he approached, his eyes flicking to the hat before meeting the man's gaze. The man smiled politely. "Afternoon, officer." The officer, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun, stopped a few feet away from the man. He had the calm yet measured demeanor of someone who had handled countless mundane calls but understood the need to tread carefully. His gaze lingered on the hat for a moment before he spoke. "Afternoon," the officer said, his voice neutral. "We've received some calls from the neighbors. They're concerned about someone walking around the area, and I'm here to check things out." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression calm. "Walking around is a cause for concern these days?" he asked, his tone light but with a subtle undercurrent that hinted at something deeper. The officer didn't rise to the bait. "You're not from this neighborhood, are you?" he asked instead, shifting his weight slightly. "No, I'm not," the man replied evenly. "But I wasn't aware that strolling through a neighborhood required residency." From across the street, Eleanor and Mrs. Carmichael stood on their porches, their arms crossed tightly as they watched the interaction unfold. Charlie had joined them, leaning against the railing with a grimace that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with how things were playing out, but wasn't willing to speak up either. "I don't like the way he's talking to the officer," Eleanor muttered to Mrs. Carmichael, her voice low but filled with indignation. "So smug." "Typical," Mrs. Carmichael replied, clutching her pearls as though they were a shield against whatever trouble she imagined the man might bring. The officer glanced at the man's hat again before returning his gaze to his face. "What's your name?" he asked. The man reached into his pocket, moving slowly so as not to alarm the officer, and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open and handed over his ID. "There you go," he said, his tone polite. The officer took the ID, his eyes scanning it briefly. His brow furrowed slightly, though he said nothing, instead handing it back after a moment. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" he asked, still maintaining his professional demeanor. "Just getting to know the area," the man said. "It's a nice day for a walk." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't entirely convinced, but there was nothing overtly suspicious about the man's behavior, other than the calls from the neighbors, which were clearly more about the hat than anything else. He glanced over his shoulder at the growing cluster of onlookers, their expectant faces making it clear they wouldn't be satisfied until something was done. "Mind if I ask where you're headed?" the officer asked, turning back to the man. "Not at all," the man replied. "I was planning to head to the park, maybe sit on a bench for a while. Unless that's against the rules?" "Not against the rules," the officer said quickly, though the faint tension in his voice suggested he was still weighing his next move. From her porch, Eleanor made a small sound of frustration. "Why is this taking so long?" she muttered. "He's probably trying to talk his way out of trouble," Mrs. Carmichael nodded in agreement. I hope the officer doesn't fall for it. People like that are always looking for loopholes. Charlie, standing a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably. He doesn't seem like he's doing anything wrong, he said hesitantly, his words earning a sharp glare from Eleanor. Of course he doesn't, she snapped. That's how they operate. Act innocent until it's too late. Across the street, the officer was still speaking with the man, though his posture had relaxed slightly. You mentioned you're not from this neighborhood, he said. Are you visiting someone here? The man shook his head. Just passing through, he said. I like exploring different areas. The officer nodded slowly, his gaze flicking to the group of neighbors who were now openly watching the exchange. He sighed inwardly, recognizing the social pressure that had likely spurred the calls in the first place. Still, he knew better than to let his personal opinions interfere with his duty. All right, he said finally. I'm going to ask you to stick to public areas like the park. Some of the neighbors are uneasy. The man raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. Uneasy? About what exactly? The officer hesitated, glancing again at the hat before clearing his throat. It's just, you're not familiar to them, that's all. The man's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Not familiar, he repeated. That's a polite way of putting it. Before the officer could respond, Eleanor took a bold step off her porch and began striding toward them, Mrs. Carmichael trailing hesitantly behind. Charlie remained where he was, his arms crossed as he watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. Excuse me, officer, Eleanor called out, her tone sharp and authoritative. I think I speak for everyone here when I say this man needs to explain what he's doing in our neighborhood. The officer turned, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. Ma'am, I'm handling this, he said, holding up a hand to stop her from coming any closer. But Eleanor was undeterred. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze darting to the man before returning to the officer. He's been walking up and down the street, acting suspicious, she said. And that hat, well, you know what it represents. It's making people uncomfortable. The man said nothing, his calm gaze fixed on Eleanor as though he were studying her, cataloging every word and gesture. It made her bristle, but she refused to back down. He doesn't belong here, Eleanor continued, her voice rising slightly. And if you're not going to do anything about it, I'll have to take this higher. The officer sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, I've already spoken with him, and there's no evidence that he's done anything wrong. No evidence yet, Eleanor shot back. But mark my words, this kind of thing always leads to trouble. Mrs. Carmichael nodded fervently, though she kept a step behind Eleanor, her posture less confrontational. We just want to feel safe in our own neighborhood, she added, her tone softer but no less accusatory. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the man beat him to it. Safe, he said, his voice low but firm. That's an interesting choice of words. Eleanor turned on him, her eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? The man met her gaze evenly, his expression unreadable. It means I'm curious what you think I'm threatening, your safety, or your sense of control. Eleanor's jaw tightened, her indignation rising like a tide. The officer, sensing the conversation was veering into dangerous territory, stepped between them. All right, that's enough, he said, his voice firm. Sir, you're free to go, but I'd recommend sticking to the park for now. The man's smile returned, faint but unmistakable. I'll keep that in mind, he said. The man gave a slight nod to the officer and turned toward the park, his steps deliberate and unhurried. The tension in the air lingered, even as he moved farther away from the cluster of neighbors still gathered on their porches. Eleanor glared at his retreating figure, her hands on her hips, her mouth twisted in a mix of frustration and indignation. That's it, she demanded, her voice sharp as she turned back to the officer. You're just letting him walk away? This is unacceptable. The officer sighed, adjusting his belt and fixing Eleanor with a measured stare. Ma'am, I've spoken with him, checked his ID, and he hasn't done anything wrong. There's no law against walking down the street or wearing a hat, regardless of what it says. Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "That hat represents divisiveness," she snapped. "It's a symbol of everything that's wrong with this country. And you're just going to stand there and do nothing?" Behind her, Mrs. Carmichael nodded emphatically, though she kept her distance, her usual confidence shaken by the officer's calm but firm response. Charlie shifted uncomfortably, looking between Eleanor and the officer, his expression uneasy. "Maybe we're overreacting," Charlie ventured, his voice low and hesitant. "The guy's just walking. He hasn't done anything." Eleanor whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "Overreacting? Charlie, people like him don't just stroll into neighborhoods like this for no reason. He's testing boundaries, seeing how far he can push before we push back. And if we don't, this place will go downhill before you know it." The man reached the park and found an empty bench beneath the shade of a large oak tree. He sat down, adjusting his hat and leaning back with a sigh of contentment. From a distance, he could see the small crowd of neighbors still gathered, their gestures animated as they argued among themselves. He chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head. Nearby, a young boy kicked a soccer ball with his father, their laughter carrying on the light breeze. A jogger passed by, nodding politely as she glanced at the man on the bench. Unlike the residents of Magnolia Lane, the park-goers seemed unfazed by his presence, too caught up in their own activities to pay him much attention. But back at the houses, the tension was far from over. Eleanor's frustration boiled over as she turned back to the officer. "If you won't do your job, I'll call someone who will," she declared, pulling her phone from her pocket. The officer raised an eyebrow, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, I've already addressed the situation. If you call the precinct again, they'll tell you the same thing." Eleanor ignored him, dialing quickly and holding the phone to her ear. "Yes, this is Eleanor Crandall, and I need to speak with someone about a public safety concern," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "There's a man loitering in our neighborhood, and the officer on the scene is refusing to take appropriate action." Charlie winced, inching away from the scene as Mrs. Carmichael hovered uncertainly nearby. The officer sighed heavily, muttering something under his breath as he turned and walked back to his patrol car. Eleanor's call was brief but pointed, and by the time she hung up, her expression was one of grim satisfaction. "They'll send someone else," she announced, her gaze sweeping over the small group of neighbors still gathered. "Someone who understands the importance of protecting our community." Charlie hesitated, his unease growing with every word. "Eleanor, don't you think this is getting a little out of hand?" he asked cautiously. "The guy hasn't done anything. You're making it sound like he's some kind of threat." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly what he is," she said sharply. "And if you're too blind to see it, then stay out of my way." Charlie opened his mouth to respond but thought better of it, shaking his head and retreating to his porch. Mrs. Carmichael glanced at him, her expression uncertain, but ultimately remained at Eleanor's side, clutching her pearls as though they might somehow shield her from whatever danger she imagined. At the park, the man remained seated, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, taking in the scene around him. He noticed a few of the neighbors venturing closer, their movements hesitant but deliberate, as though they were trying to appear casual while keeping him within view. He smiled faintly, amused by their thinly veiled suspicion. The officer, still leaning against his patrol car, kept a watchful eye on the situation. He had no intention of escalating things further, but he knew the residents of Willow Creek well enough to know that they weren't likely to let the matter drop. His radio crackled with a brief update from dispatch, confirming that another unit had been requested to the scene. The man on the bench noticed the officer glance toward him and offered a polite nod. The officer hesitated before nodding back, though his expression remained guarded. Eleanor, meanwhile, had regrouped with Mrs. Carmichael and a few other neighbors, rallying them with her usual fervor. "We can't just sit back and do nothing," she declared, her voice rising with each word. "This is our neighborhood, and we have every right to protect it." "Protect it from what?" a voice called out from the edge of the group. All eyes turned to a younger woman standing with her arms crossed, her expression skeptical. "The guy's just sitting in the park. What exactly are you protecting us from?" Eleanor bristled, her face reddening. From people who don't belong here, she snapped. From people who think they can come in and disrupt the order we've worked so hard to maintain. The younger woman raised an eyebrow. You mean people who wear hats you don't like? It's not just the hat. Eleanor shot back, her voice cracking with indignation. It's what it stands for. It's a statement, and it's one that has no place in Willow Creek. The younger woman shook her head, her lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. You're so busy looking for enemies that you don't even see what you're turning into. Before Eleanor could respond, the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder as another patrol car approached. The group fell silent, their heads turning as the vehicle pulled up to the curb. The officer who stepped out was younger, his stride confident as he approached the scene. He exchanged a brief word with the first officer, who gestured toward the park. The new arrival nodded and began walking toward the man on the bench, his expression unreadable. The younger officer adjusted his belt as he approached the man sitting on the bench. His boots crunched against the gravel, but the man didn't move, his relaxed posture unchanged. The officer stopped a few feet away, his expression neutral but cautious, as though he was already bracing for confrontation. "Afternoon, sir," the younger officer began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of formality. "I've been called here to address some concerns raised by residents in the area. Would you mind telling me what brings you to this park today?" The man tilted his head slightly, looking up at the officer with a calm gaze. "I was just sitting here enjoying the day," he said evenly. "Is that a problem?" The officer glanced at the man's hat, the bold Harris-Walz lettering catching the light. His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained composed. "Some of the residents feel uneasy about your presence," he explained. "They've asked us to investigate." The man leaned back slightly, his arms resting on the bench behind him. "Uneasy," he repeated, his tone thoughtful. Interesting choice of words. "Did they explain why my sitting on a public bench is cause for concern?" The officer hesitated, clearly not expecting the question. "It's not just the sitting," he said carefully. "It's, your appearance, specifically the hat you're wearing." The man's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "So it's the hat," he said softly. "I see." From a distance, Eleanor watched the exchange intently, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Mrs. Carmichael stood beside her, clutching her handbag as though it offered some kind of reassurance. Behind them, Charlie had stepped onto his porch. As he leaned against the railing, his expression growing darker by the minute. "They're finally questioning him properly," Eleanor muttered, her tone sharp and triumphant. "About time." Mrs. Carmichael nodded but remained silent, her gaze darting nervously. The officer, sensing the growing tension, cleared his throat and straightened his posture. "Sir," he began, his voice taking on a firmer edge, "we're just trying to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone in this neighborhood. If you wouldn't mind removing the hat or leaving the area, I think that would go a long way in resolving this." The man's smile widened slightly, but there was no humor in it. "So, let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You're asking me to either remove my hat or leave this public park, because other people don't like it?" The officer hesitated, his stance shifting slightly as he glanced back toward the group of neighbors gathered at the edge of the park. Eleanor gave an exaggerated nod, gesturing toward the man as though urging the officer to press harder. "It's not about what people like or don't like," the officer said finally, turning back to the man. "It's about maintaining the peace." The man chuckled softly, the sound low and dry. "Peace," he repeated. "That's what you're maintaining by asking someone to leave for wearing a hat." The officer's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I don't make the complaints, I just respond to them. Now, are you going to comply? Or do we need to escalate this further?" The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Escalate," he said, his tone soft but firm. "That's another interesting choice of words. Go ahead, officer. Escalate." For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them thick with tension. The younger officer's hand hovered near his belt, though he didn't reach for anything. The man remained still, his calm demeanor unshaken. Eleanor, watching from the sidelines, huffed impatiently. "What is he waiting for?" she muttered. "Just arrest him already." Charlie, who had remained silent for most of the ordeal, finally spoke up. "For what, Eleanor?" he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "What exactly has he done that deserves arrest?" Eleanor turned on him, her eyes narrowing. "Are you serious, Charlie? He's been antagonizing the entire neighborhood for hours, walking around like he owns the place, wearing that," she gestured toward the park, her voice dripping with disdain. "Provocative hat." Charlie shook his head, his arms dropping to his sides. "Provocative," he said bitterly. "That's all this is about, isn't it? The hat. Not his behavior, not his actions, just the hat." Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "You're missing the point, as usual," she snapped. "It's about what that hat represents. It's divisive. It doesn't belong here." "And who decides what belongs here, Eleanor?" Charlie shot back. "You? The homeowners association? The police? Or is it just whoever yells the loudest?" Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her usual sharp wit failing her for once. Mrs. Carmichael placed a hand on her arm, trying to calm her down, but Eleanor shook her off, her eyes blazing. "You're being ridiculous, Charlie," she said finally. "This isn't about me. It's about protecting our neighborhood from people who don't respect it." Charlie let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head again. "Respect," he muttered. "Right?" Back at the park, the younger officer took a step back, pulling out his radio and speaking into it briefly. The man watched him with mild interest, his expression unreadable. A moment later, the first officer, who had remained by his patrol car, approached, his expression less guarded but no less serious. "Is there a problem here?" the first officer asked, his gaze flicking between his colleague and the man on the bench. "Not yet," the younger officer replied, though his tone suggested he believed it was only a matter of time. The man smiled faintly. "Good to know I'm not a problem yet," he said. The first officer sighed, glancing back at the growing crowd of neighbors. "Look," he said, his voice low but firm, "we're just trying to keep this from escalating. If you could work with us here, we'd appreciate it." The man raised an eyebrow. "Work with you," he repeated. "Is that what you call this?" The first officer hesitated but didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. The younger officer's grip tightened on his radio as the murmurs from the small crowd of neighbors grew louder. Eleanor, emboldened by what she perceived as inaction from the officers, began to move closer to the park, her steps brisk and purposeful. The first officer noticed her approach and turned slightly, holding up a hand to signal her to stop, but she ignored him. The man on the bench glanced in her direction, his calm gaze following her every step as though he were merely observing a passing bird. "This is ridiculous," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the park. "You've spent all this time talking, and nothing has been done. Do you even understand what kind of message you're sending to the community right now?" The first officer sighed audibly, his patience wearing thin. "Ma'am, I've asked you to stay back. We're handling this." "Handling it?" Eleanor snapped, her hands flying to her hips. "You're letting him sit there like he owns the place. If you can't see how dangerous the situation is, then maybe you're not qualified to be handling anything." The man leaned back against the bench, crossing one ankle over his knee in a relaxed pose. "Dangerous?" he said, the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. "That's an interesting way to describe someone sitting in a public park." Eleanor whirled on him, her face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare act like you're innocent," she spat. "You walk in here with that hat, stirring up tension, making everyone uncomfortable, and now you have the nerve to play the victim?" The man's smile widened slightly, though it lacked warmth. "Uncomfortable, you say? And what exactly is it about me that makes you uncomfortable?" "You know exactly what it is," Eleanor shot back. "That hat is a symbol of everything people like you stand for. Divisiveness, arrogance, disrespect for real values." The man tilted his head slightly, as though considering her words. "Interesting," he said after a moment. "You see divisiveness, arrogance, and disrespect. I see a hat. Eleanor's jaw tightened, her hands balling into fists at her sides. You can try to downplay it all you want, she said through gritted teeth, but you're not fooling anyone. The younger officer stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Eleanor and the man. Ma'am, I need you to step back, he said, his tone firm. You're escalating the situation. Escalating? Eleanor repeated, her voice rising. I'm the one escalating. He's the one who doesn't belong here. He's the one causing a scene. By sitting quietly on a bench, the man interjected, his tone dry. Truly scandalous behavior. Eleanor glared at him, her chest heaving with indignation. You think this is funny? You think you can just waltz in here and disrupt our community and get away with it? I think, the man replied calmly, that you're making a lot of assumptions about someone you know nothing about. Before Eleanor could respond, the younger officer placed a hand on her arm, gently but firmly guiding her back toward the edge of the park. Ma'am, please, he said, his voice quieter now. Let us do our job. Eleanor shook him off with a huff, retreating a few steps but remaining within earshot. Mrs. Carmichael hovered nearby, her wide eyes darting nervously between Eleanor and the officers. Charlie, still standing on his porch, let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. The first officer turned back to the man on the bench, his expression tired but resolute. Look, he said, this is obviously upsetting a lot of people. I'm asking you one last time. Can you just leave the area? It's not worth all this trouble. The man's smile faded, and for the first time, his expression turned serious. Trouble, he repeated, his voice low. That's an interesting choice of words. Tell me, officer, what exactly is the trouble here? Is it me, or is it them? The first officer hesitated, glancing back at the group of neighbors watching intently from the sidelines. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The man continued before he could recover. I'm sitting on a bench, the man said, his tone steady but firm. I haven't spoken to anyone except you. I haven't broken any laws, caused any disturbances, or threatened anyone. And yet, I'm the one you're asking to leave. Why is that? The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the first officer as though seeking guidance. The first officer cleared his throat, his voice wavering slightly as he replied, It's not about you specifically. It's about keeping the peace. Keeping the peace, the man repeated, his voice carrying a weight that made both officers pause. Funny how that always seems to mean silencing the person who's different, rather than addressing the people who can't handle difference. Eleanor let out a sharp laugh from the sidelines. Oh, please, she said, don't try to make this about discrimination. You're the one who came in here looking for trouble. The man turned his gaze to her, his eyes cool and steady. Looking for trouble, he said softly. You mean walking down the street? Sitting in a park? Wearing a hat? If that's what you call looking for trouble, then maybe the trouble isn't with me. Eleanor's face turned a deeper shade of red, but before she could respond, a third officer arrived on the scene. He was older, his uniform crisp and his stride confident. He surveyed the scene quickly, his sharp eyes taking in the man on the bench, the two younger officers, and the group of neighbors watching from a distance. His expression was unreadable as he approached. The first officer stepped forward to meet him, speaking quietly as he explained the situation. The older officer nodded once, his gaze flicking briefly to the man before returning to the younger officer. He murmured something in reply, then turned and began walking toward the bench. The man watched him approach, his posture unchanged but his eyes narrowing slightly as the older officer stopped in front of him. The air seemed to grow heavier, the tension crackling like static electricity. The older officer removed his hat, holding it in one hand as he extended the other toward the man. Good to see you, sir, he said, his voice low but steady. The man didn't move for a moment, his gaze fixed on the older officer. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and clasped the offered hand, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Eleanor, watching from the sidelines, froze in place, her mouth falling open in shock. Mrs. Carmichael gasped audibly, clutching her pearls so tightly they threatened to snap. Charlie straightened from where he had been leaning, his brows furrowing in confusion. "What's going on?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp and tinged with panic. "Why are they shaking hands?" The younger officers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions unreadable as the man rose from the bench, his presence suddenly towering and commanding. The older officer stepped back slightly, his posture one of quiet respect. The man adjusted his hat, his faint smile now tinged with something far more dangerous: authority. The older officer's gaze remained fixed on the man as he straightened his hat, his calm demeanor now carrying an unmistakable air of authority. The murmurs from the gathered neighbors grew louder, their confusion and disbelief rippling through the small crowd like a wave. Eleanor, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line, took an involuntary step forward, her voice breaking through the tense silence. "Who is he?" she demanded, her tone a mix of indignation and fear. "What's going on here?" The man turned his gaze toward her, his faint smile fading as he regarded her with an unreadable expression. He didn't answer immediately, letting the question hang in the air as the tension built. The older officer, still standing beside him, finally broke the silence, his voice firm but respectful. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Eleanor directly, "I think it's time we clarify a few things. The man you've been calling the police about, the man you've been harassing, this is Chief Wallace, your new police chief." The words landed like a thunderclap, the collective gasp from the neighbors audible even from a distance. Eleanor's face turned an alarming shade of red, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process what she'd just heard. Mrs. Carmichael let out a small, strangled sound, her hand flying to her chest as if to steady herself. Charlie, standing a few feet away, simply blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked dangerously close to amusement. The younger officers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their postures stiffening as the weight of the revelation settled over them. The man, Chief Wallace, remained silent, his steady gaze sweeping over the group of neighbors before returning to the older officer. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Wallace said finally, his tone calm but carrying a quiet authority that left no room for argument. He turned back to Eleanor, his hands resting casually at his sides. "So," he said, his voice steady and even, "this is what you do when someone different walks through your neighborhood?" Eleanor sputtered, her indignation faltering under the weight of his words. I didn't know who you were," she stammered, her voice trembling with a mix of panic and defiance. "If I had known, would it have made a difference?" Wallace interrupted, his tone sharper now, though he didn't raise his voice. "Would you have treated me any differently if I hadn't been the police chief? Or was this about something else entirely?" Eleanor's mouth opened again, but no words came out. Her gaze darted around, seeking support from the other neighbors, but most of them were now avoiding her eyes, their own discomfort palpable. Even Mrs. Carmichael, usually her staunchest ally, seemed unwilling to meet her gaze. Wallace stepped closer, his presence commanding but not aggressive. "You called the police because you didn't like the way I looked," he said, his voice low but cutting. "Because I wore a hat that made you uncomfortable. You didn't ask me who I was or why I was here. You just assumed." Eleanor's lip quivered, her previous bravado crumbling under his steady gaze. I thought you might be dangerous," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Wallace's smile returned, though it was colder now, devoid of humor. "Dangerous," he repeated. "And what exactly about me seemed dangerous? Was it the hat? The way I walked? Or was it just the fact that I didn't fit your idea of what belongs in this neighborhood?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the ground, her shoulders hunching as though she were trying to make herself smaller. For the first time, she seemed to realize the full extent of what she'd done. Charlie, emboldened by the shift in power, finally stepped forward, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You owe him an apology, Eleanor," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You owe all of us an apology." Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with the last remnants of her indignation. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood," she said weakly, though her words carried none of the conviction they had earlier. "From what?" Wallace asked, his voice quiet but piercing. "From a man walking down the street? From someone sitting in a park? Or from your own assumptions?" The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one dared to speak. Even the younger officers remained silent, their expressions a mix of guilt and discomfort as they shifted uneasily on their feet. The older officer, still standing nearby, cleared his throat and stepped forward, addressing Wallace directly. "Chief," he said, his tone careful, "what would you like us to do next?" Wallace glanced at him, his expression softening slightly. "Stand down," he said simply. "There's nothing to do here." The older officer nodded, gesturing to the younger officers to fall back. They did so reluctantly, their movements slow and uncertain as they returned to their patrol cars. Wallace turned back to the group of neighbors, his gaze sweeping over them one last time. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "This neighborhood is part of my jurisdiction now, and I won't tolerate discrimination, harassment, or fear-mongering against anyone. Do I make myself clear?" The neighbors nodded mutely, their previous hostility now replaced by a mix of shame and discomfort. Wallace's gaze lingered on Eleanor for a moment longer before he turned and began walking away, his steps as calm and deliberate as they had been when he first arrived. Wallace's measured steps carried him toward the patrol cars, his commanding presence unbroken, while Eleanor remained frozen in place, her face alternating between red-hot anger and pale embarrassment. The neighbors stood silently, their collective shame palpable as they processed what had just happened. Mrs. Carmichael clutched her pearls so tightly that her knuckles were white, and Charlie's lips curled into a small but unmistakable smirk. For the first time in years, it seemed Eleanor had finally been put in her place. But Wallace wasn't done yet. He stopped near the patrol cars, turning back to the crowd. The air felt charged as his calm, authoritative voice cut through the silence. "Eleanor Crandall," he said, his gaze locking onto hers like a hawk spotting prey. "Since you seem to have so many concerns about this neighborhood, let's address them right here, right now." Eleanor flinched, her composure slipping further. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, but her voice trembled, betraying her. Wallace crossed his arms, his expression unreadable but undeniably firm. "You've spent all afternoon trying to drive me out of this neighborhood because you claim I don't belong. Yet, from what I've observed, the only threat to peace and safety here is your behavior." The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder, several of them nodding in reluctant agreement. Eleanor's head whipped around, her eyes wide as she realized the tide was turning against her. "I was just trying to protect our community," she said, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "You can't fault me for caring about where I live." Wallace's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it was cold and devoid of humor. "Protect the community? Let's talk about that. While I was walking through this neighborhood, your so-called community, I saw you glaring at me through your window. I saw you rallying others, stirring them up without a shred of evidence that I was a threat. And when the officers told you I wasn't breaking any laws, you escalated the situation anyway. Is that what you call protecting the community?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but Wallace held up a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "No," he continued, his voice growing sharper. "What you were doing wasn't protection. It was harassment. You didn't care about safety, you cared about control. You saw someone who didn't fit your narrow definition of belonging, and you decided that was enough to justify calling the police. But let me make one thing clear. This isn't your neighborhood to control. Not anymore." The crowd shifted uneasily, some of them averting their eyes, while others exchanged glances that ranged from guilty to outright amused. Eleanor, on the other hand, looked as though she might combust on the spot. Her mouth moved soundlessly, her usual sharp wit failing her entirely. Charlie, emboldened by Wallace's words, stepped forward, his voice ringing out with uncharacteristic confidence. "He's right, Eleanor. You've been running this neighborhood like your personal fiefdom for years, and it's about time someone called you out on it." Eleanor spun toward him, her eyes blazing. "I've done nothing but look out for this neighborhood," she snapped. "Everything I've done is for the good of the community." "For the good of the community?" Charlie shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean spying on your neighbors, spreading rumors, and calling the police on anyone who doesn't look or act the way you want them to? That's not protecting anyone, Eleanor. That's bullying." The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder, and this time, the majority of them were nodding. Eleanor looked around desperately, searching for an ally, but even Mrs. Carmichael had taken a cautious step back, her expression uncertain. Wallace stepped forward again, his calm gaze pinning Eleanor in place. "You wanted me gone because of a hat," he said, his voice low but no less powerful. "A piece of fabric with some words on it. That's all it took for you to decide I didn't belong here. That's the kind of narrow-minded thinking that divides communities, not protects them." Eleanor's face burned with humiliation, her defiance crumbling under the weight of his words. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Wallace tilted his head slightly, his gaze unyielding. "Didn't you?" he asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you meant every word you said." Before Eleanor could respond, Wallace turned to address the entire group of neighbors. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, his voice carrying across the park. "This community is part of my jurisdiction now, and I take that responsibility seriously. My job isn't just to enforce the law, it's to build trust, fairness, and mutual respect. And I can't do that if people like Eleanor are undermining that mission with their bias and fear." The crowd was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Even those who had initially sided with Eleanor seemed to shrink under his piercing gaze. "From now on," Wallace continued, "this neighborhood will be a place where everyone is welcome, regardless of what they wear, where they come from, or what they believe. If you have a problem with that, then maybe it's you who doesn't belong." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, the final nail in Eleanor's self-made coffin. She took a shaky step back, her gaze darting around as though searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The neighbors she had once rallied to her side now looked at her with disdain, their faces filled with the realization that they had been complicit in her pettiness. Charlie, unable to resist the moment, crossed his arms and smirked. "Looks like you've lost your throne, Eleanor." The jab hit its mark, and Eleanor let out a strangled noise, her humiliation complete. She turned and hurried away, her head down and her shoulders hunched, leaving behind a trail of shame as she disappeared back into her house. The slam of her front door echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Wallace watched her retreat with an air of quiet satisfaction. He turned back to the remaining neighbors, his gaze softening slightly. "I hope this has been a wake-up call," he said. "You don't have to like everyone who lives here, but you do have to respect them. That's the only way we build a stronger community." The neighbors murmured their agreement, many of them nodding. Charlie stepped forward, extending a hand to Wallace. "Chief Wallace," he said with a sheepish smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Wallace took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you, Charlie," he said. "I think this is going to be an interesting chapter for all of us." As Wallace turned to leave, the crowd slowly began to disperse, the weight of the day's events settling over them like a heavy fog. Eleanor's absence was palpable, her reign of control finally broken. And though the neighborhood still had a long way to go, there was an unspoken sense of relief. Change had come, and it was for the better. Eleanor's blinds were drawn tightly shut, her presence inside the house a quiet reminder of the day's events. Across the street, Charlie stood on his porch, a small, thoughtful smile playing on his lips. He raised a hand in a parting wave as Wallace got into his car, and Wallace returned the gesture, a faint nod of acknowledgement. Driving away, Wallace reflected on the day's confrontation. It wasn't just about a hat, it was never about a hat. It was about the assumptions people make, the lines they draw, and the walls they build to protect themselves from imagined threats. But sometimes, those walls only isolate us further. blinding us to the humanity on the other side. And so, a question lingers: how often do we let fear and prejudice dictate our actions? How many opportunities to connect, to understand, to grow, do we squander because of the labels we place on others? It's easy to judge from a distance, harder to face the truth when it's standing right in front of us. The lesson is clear. True strength lies in building bridges, not burning them. In the end, it's not about who belongs where, it's about who has the courage to create a space where everyone belongs. What kind of neighbor do you want to be? What kind of community do you want to build? The choice is yours.